Hi, and welcome to Nature, Health and Wellbeing, a podcast by Conservation Volunteers Australia. This podcast examines the intersection between nature, human health and wellbeing, exploring how these are all interconnected and why it's important we take care of each of them. Episodes will feature a panel of experts discussing topics like climate burnout, how to connect with nature, and much more. Let's get started.
Welcome everyone, my name's Kit Klein and I'm the host of this podcast segment on the benefits of community urban biodiverse spaces for mental health and connectivity. Today we have two guests here to talk about this topic. We have Dr. Kit Prendergast and Dean Cracknell. So just to give a basic overview, Dr. Kit Prendergast, affectionately known as the Bee Babette, is a wild bee ecologist from Perth, Western Australia. She earned her PhD from Curtin University, focusing on the biodiversity of native bees and pollination. So welcome, Dr. Kit. And Dean Cracknell is the co-founder of Town Team Movement, a social enterprise dedicated to fostering community-driven placemaking initiatives across Australia and beyond. And welcome, Dean. So I'll start off with you, Dr. Kit. Would you like to give a brief overview of the work you're doing?
Thanks for having me on, other Kit. I don't often meet other people called Kit, so it's exciting. So my work, even at the moment, has always been quite diverse. My PhD was on protecting native bees in urban areas, but that involved a lot of facets, including bee hotels and bee hotel design, the floral factors that influence native bees in an area, including the species diversity of flora, their exotic versus native status, and also looking at the impact of introduced species, including introduced European honeybees, on native bees and pollination networks. But around this time I started my PhD, I also created a Facebook group, the Buzz and Wild Bees, initially to recruit people who I could survey their gardens, because a key question was, are there differences in bee communities between people's gardens and bushland remnants? And then that evolved in sort of like a big community sort of sharing information about native bees, then a citizen science project. During my PhD, I also did like lots of little side projects, including looking at bees in apple orchards in Tasmania. I went to Stradbroke Island to look at bees on the island. And also, after I finished my PhD, I still was interested in like urban ecology and native bees, but then I also did work in the Jarrah Forest looking at native bees in mining rehab areas. I've looked at pollinators of critically endangered plants, bees on traditional landowner lands, more community projects, doing surveys for land care groups. So yeah, really diverse at the moment. I just had a baby, so I'm not doing as much, but I have been doing a postdoc on pollinators of canola and also doing surveys of native bees in an ecological impact assessment context. And I still really love engaging with community, doing talks, presentations, circus comedy performances related to bees. So that's my work. It's many different things, but all centered around pollinators and conservation and native bees.
I'm curious to know the topic of bees and pollination. Was this something you've been interested in from a young age?
So I've always really loved nature, the environment and animals, like huge animal lover. My nickname when I was in year 7 was Animal Freak, because I just loved animals. I'd be that kid that was like walking at school and see a bug and be like, oh, look at that cool bug. Like most people, except fairly recently, I grew up without any knowledge or education of bees other than honeybees. And I feel like that's really sad. Like I missed out on engaging with a huge component of biodiversity. And I just knew about that single species, which is, still important for the economy, makes honey important in human history, but it's not really part of our native environment. So growing up in Australia, I didn't learn about the indigenous bees. So I didn't have that fascination really with bees until my mid-20s. So yeah, always loved nature and pollinators. And when people asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was a kid, I was like, I want to be whatever David Attenborough is. I didn't know what he was. I just wanted to be that. So yeah, really, really loved all, pollinators, insects, but didn't have that deeper appreciation or even awareness.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
Dean, welcome again. Would you be able to give us a brief overview of the work that you're doing as well?
Yeah, thanks, Kit. So I love helping people create positive change. And I've had a bit of a meandering journey to get to where I am now, but studied urban planning after a decade or so traveling around the world and seeing lots of incredible places and meeting great people, and was re-inspired by urban planning in some ways, and worked in local government for 12 years, which was fantastic experience, and got to learn so much, particularly how the systems work or sometimes don't work. But pretty quickly into being a practicing urban planner, realised that urban planning could do some things, but really you needed so many other things to happen in a city or a community for that place to thrive. And got really curious. So I started volunteering in my own local community, which opened up a whole another world of meeting new people and trying new things and learning new skills. So I've sort of been doing this sort of stuff 24/7 for 15 or 20 years now. And I guess where I've ended up and where Town Team Movement is sort of positioned is between government and community, and increasingly business as well. And what we find that there is lots of goodwill on both sides, but there's often a disconnection there between community and government in particular, but also, philanthropy and big business. So that's what I'm really intrigued by, that ecosystem that sits between all these different agencies, local governments, communities, community groups, local leaders and doers, and how do we get people on the same page or creating the connection so that good things can happen and places can improve. So that's what I'm really inspired and passionate about. And sometimes I feel, I do think about the bee analogy a little bit, in that we are sort of pollinators of different ideas, because we get to go and meet lots of different people from not only around Australia, but also around the world, and learn how they do things. And we sort of take those back to our hive at Town Team Movement, and then make that information available to other people or communities or governments when they want to do something similar. So sort of see that the pollination of ideas and tips and tactics as being an important part of our role.
I love that. I really love that metaphor of pollination, in the work that you do in community as well. And I guess, Kit, that leads me on to a question for you is, can you share what biodiversity in urban spaces means, and why is it so crucial to have this biodiversity in urban spaces?
The definition of biodiversity is always quite fluid, but at its basic, it's how many species there are. But that's, especially in an urban context, that's actually probably a poor definition of biodiversity. It'd be more about the native species diversity. And my research has really, I guess, emphasized that from a native bee point of view. So one of the things I was looking at when I was doing my research on urban bees was, what factors influence the number of different native bee species that you find in a particular habitat. And my hypothesis was that the more plant species there were, the more native bees there were in terms of individuals and species. And shockingly, I found the opposite. I found a significant negative association between plant diversity and native bee abundance and a diversity. I was like, what? This doesn't make sense at first. But then I looked further into it. And when you're looking at a garden, someone's garden, especially in a residential context, many people have lots of different plant species, but most of these are exotic plants. And our native bees have co-evolved with our native flora. Many of them are really specialized. So you can have a garden full of plants, but if the plants are all exotics, only a small fraction of the native bees can actually forage on them. So biodiversity, I think, really needs to take into account the indigenous versus exotic status of the species we're looking at. And then another aspect of biodiversity is the spatial turnover of species. So you could have, for example, the Greater Perth region, and there could be 20 habitats in there, and every habitat had the same 5 species. Or you could have different species, different 5 species in every single one of those 20 habitats. So that's a spatial diversity. And I found that in bushland remnants, there is a massive diversity and turnover, even between bushland remnants that are, not too far apart. So we've got that spatial diversity as well. And I guess the core thing from this is that, biodiversity is looking at the native status as well as the sort of spatial diversity and landscape diversity within these landscapes. So, having diverse flowers that are native to Australia in urban spaces is really important. I think that's something that's only just starting to be recognised. Your sort of like typical English cottage garden might have lots of species, but probably not many species of native bees or native birds. That's what I think the takeaway message for what biodiversity is and why it's important when we're looking at supporting greater biodiversity as well.
I'm wondering, how does that contribute to human health?
The interest in, human health and biodiversity, environmental health has been quite long-standing. The biophilia hypothesis that was developed by Wilson and Kellett, they claim, and it's pretty well supported, that human beings, we are part of nature, and we have this connection to nature. And when we don't have that connection, we feel disconnected. But then there's some, nuance in that as well. So there's been numerous studies onto the mental health benefits or lack of benefits from interacting with nature. And I guess part of the mixed results that we have is because there's many different definitions of nature. Nature to some, people might be defined as any green space, but then a lawn, even though that is nature, it's not that sort of native biodiverse. But there have been studies that have found interacting with nature improves cognition. For example, there was a study that was published that in Journal of Affective Disorders, and they found that people with depression, they benefited from going for a walk in nature and had, increased mood benefits, and they controlled for just exercise benefits mood, but they had people walk in natural green spaces versus just in an urban area that wasn't that green and biodiverse. And so they did have benefits there. And then there was a paper called Green Infrastructure Through the Lens of One Health. That was a systematic review. And they found that 114 indicators of green space quality affected mental health and wildlife support. And there's also synergies between that. But there actually hasn't been much research into, so I suppose, biodiversity per se. It's more just green space or nature, but not actual biodiversity. And as I said, I guess how people think of nature or biodiversity might impact whether they have those benefits. Bring it closer to home. I was involved in a study called the Social and Ecological Values of Native Gardens Along Streets, a socio-ecological study in the suburbs of Perth. And it was looking at verge gardens. My role was to see if that verge gardens supported native pollinators, and they did, the native verge gardens. But we also looked at people's motivations, and many of them were motivated to also experience wildlife and also social interactions. So talking to neighbours, people stopping and looking at the native verge garden. So there are those mental social benefits as well. So there's definitely plenty of theory as well as support for benefits between mental health and nature. But I think there's a lot more to look at in terms of biodiversity. What I'm quite interested in is that your childhood experiences also influence these benefits and set the stage as well. So there was a study called Children in Nature, Sensory Engagement and the Experience of Biodiversity, Environmental Education Research. And it supported the idea that the experience of biodiversity and children interaction with diversity allowed learning opportunities and better understanding of biodiversity as well. So having those natural experiences, and there's more and more research that like kids that go out into nature, have better health, better mental health as well, and being able to experience sensory play, fresh air, all those sort of things. And like, I'm particularly interested in this area now because I just had a baby. So I want to, really get her out into nature as much as possible. And I think because, many families do live in more urban areas, it's so important that we do allow for those experiences of children to go out in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it is about what is our early childhood experience of nature and, that introduction of biodiversity from such a young age and going out in the garden and exploring different things and educating children. And, where do we start that? In kindergarten, in school, within the own family home? Do we tie it into, mental health care as well? And I guess that leads me to the question for Dean. Your work focuses on community. How do you see urban biodiverse spaces contributing to community connectivity? And Kit just gave us a really great example.
Well, our specific role is more about inspiring and supporting local communities to do it for themselves. So we're an underarching organisation. We use an underarching approach. So we don't do it for communities, but we help to inspire or support them to do it for themselves. And that might be social connection, or it might be around supporting local businesses, or they might be environmental projects as well. So anything like that is fine. I guess at one level too, what we're really passionate about is human habitats. And many of our cities and our suburbs and streets are anti-human, and they're actually having really bad effects on us, at different levels. It's disconnecting us from people and neighbours. It's creating poor human and physical and mental health outcomes. There's a whole range of issues with the way that we create human habitats at the moment. And I think there's a lot for us to learn and relearn from natural habitats. And many of the same principles and lessons apply. But it's like we've forgotten how to be a functioning society and to operate as citizens rather than just consumers in this world. So what we're really passionate about is helping local communities and local people to create change in their own local area, whether that's from doing verge gardens or planting trees or nature block programs, through to whatever else they see as being important in their local place. And people make places and places make people, just like Dr. Kit mentioned, with our children growing up, we're fundamentally affected by what's around us and the people around us. So if we've got better quality streets or suburbs or cities, we're going to have better quality people as well. But that's a two-way process. So we need to care for our urban habitats just like we do with our natural habitats, but then they'll also care for us. So it's a reciprocal arrangement between the two, just like you'd find in a natural ecosystem.
And have you noticed any specific examples of where these spaces brought people together?
Yeah, well, the Nature Blocks program, I just think, is such a great example of how you can take a very small action to put a planter box or a garden bed and plant native plants in that rather than introduce species. And not only is that good because that's action you can directly take in your own house or on your own balcony and apartment, but it connects you with this wider network of people from around your city or your state or even the country who are doing similar things and might be motivated by different or similar motivations. So not only are you helping nature, but you're connecting with this wider social or virtual network as well. And that, I think, makes people feel good when they're part of something bigger than just themselves. So that's a really good one. And one of my favourite examples is actually from Canberra, and it's a microforest program using the Miyawaki method. And I think they've just set up a new organisation, Microforest Collective. But what they found was planting a section of a local park with this Miyawaki method not only introduced some amazing biodiversity into that space, which really needed some, but it created community as well because it asked neighbours to come together and contribute and celebrate, the achievements So it was a reason for people to come together. And sometimes in community building, we forget about what that reason is, or what's the reason for coming together or connecting or speaking to someone you don't know. So I think any kind of action which makes a place or a community better is important, but I think that's how it relates to the urban biodiversity, because there's such meaningful actions that many people want to contribute to. And many of us are very concerned about climate change. And, sometimes when you think at that global level, it does feel disempowering and a bit scary. But if you can go out and connect with your local neighbours and plant some trees or look after a local park or a verge garden, then you're making a meaningful step to doing something about it, which I think makes you feel better as a human, particularly when you're meeting like-minded people and discovering a purpose that if you just sat at home and been worried, thinking about all the big issues, you may not have had that chance to connect with people and connect with your local place.
And that gets me thinking about, climate change and the grief that comes with that. And I think when we connect community and we're engaging in, natural spaces within our own communities, we are doing something about it and we are connecting, and it makes us not feel alone. I think that's the connector as well, and that commonality of humans wanting to do better and be involved. And very, very small projects can make a big difference. And Dr. Kidd, I want to talk a little bit more about mental health, but in particular around pollination. And where do you see, whether it's through symbolic meaning or metaphor, or the work and research you've done in pollination in particular, how do we tie that into mental health care, or how can we?
Unfortunately, there hasn't been much research at all in the benefits of mental health and pollinators per se, but there is a lot of clear links between that, because having pollinators, they're essential for flowering plant reproduction, and many people get a lot of joy from flowering plants. Flowers have been important for humans, like symbolically, culturally, throughout history. So having flowering, beautiful places and spaces helps our mental health. And then, sort of tying on to what Dean said, there's a lot of initiatives with communities to create sort of pollinator spaces. And there's been a big movement lately in sort of save the bees. Unfortunately, though, I think there's so much, interest and passion behind people, but there's not much education or resources for them, especially evidence-based ones. So lots of people will think that they need to get a honeybee hive, for example, which will actually harm biodiversity and, creates, I guess, challenges between, human health risks from anaphylaxis versus, sort of benefits of having bees around. Focusing on native bees also gives people a lot more of a sense of place, because they are, local to particular areas, and people can then, plant local native plants. And on my Facebook group, people get so excited when they see, native bees coming to their garden, because I guess we see honeybees everywhere. So having honeybees visit your garden is just sort of an everyday thing. But when you see an Indigenous bee visit your garden because you have planted native plants, that's really beautiful, I think. And that sort of idea of how many species you can see, that quest to sort of discover more. So I think that's really useful and helpful. And of course, there's mental health benefits from having cleaner air, which again, if we have more trees, the air's cleaner, being able to go and walk in green spaces, all those sorts of things. But yeah, there isn't much research per se between pollinators and mental health, but just based on my own experiences, both my own personal experiences, the best thing for me, during COVID times, I was still doing my work in the Jarrah forest and literally just going into the forest by myself and listening to all the insects and the birds. That was just so beautiful and grounding, getting away from all the sort of doom, gloom, fear and everything that was the pervasive feeling at the time. So yeah, that was really, really helpful. And I was part of a global project at the same time where even for people in lockdowns, we went into our gardens and spent, I think it was 15 minutes recording pollinators on our flowers and creating a big database of like pollinator interactions in backyards during the COVID times. And I think that really gave people meaning and purpose as well. So there is definitely these benefits that we can get. And again, this is just personal experience, but as a pollination ecologist, for my work, I have to sit there for I don't usually stand there for a half an hour looking at a single tree. And it's really beautiful because I have to focus and I have to listen for the bees and, look at like the small minutiae of like tiny insects. I'll see other insects and things crawling about. And it's just, you're so switched on and you're so in tune for that 15 minutes or half an hour. So it's a really grounding experience in getting you to focus and not just, I guess, zone out when we have all these like artificial lights and noise and technology all thrown at us and our attention sort of divided everywhere. So I think, being able to like have that experience is really great. And I was involved in a citizen science project last year where it was called like Looking for UFOs because there's so many undescribed species of native bees, which is again really exciting. And we got families, people of all ages to come to a national park, and I assigned them all plant species, and they had to sit a stand and walk along this 50-meter stretch just looking at their plant species and recording what visited it. And I thought that was really great to get people out of nature, but also get them to like focus and like really engage with nature. And everyone said they really enjoyed it, but it's also teaching them like really vital skills about how to do research and how to look for pollinators and take that time to really experience nature.
And what I'm hearing, it's a practice that I teach and use with clients that I work in as a social worker, is nature-based mindfulness, where we sit in nature and we connect to our sensory system and we just observe the natural world. So there's some therapy that's going on in research. And I love that, you can record these and they can be used for benefit of research. And I'm curious to know, are there any projects or programs that can be integrated into perhaps schools or families that can be involved in this? You mentioned through COVID that people could go on apps and, record certain things for studies. Is that still continuing?
The COVID one was just for like a group of researchers who were like, we need our nature fix and we need to keep doing pollinator research. But the UFOs in Muluru River National Park, unfortunately, that project's finished because I was in Queensland and I moved back to WA, but I would love to, continue those sort of projects and programs. And I did a project with a school a while back, and the idea was to do exactly that, but to my absolute horror, this school had no flowers. I was just like, no. So what we did instead is we designed these like artificial flowers. So we got yellow and blue plates and put some sugar water in them and got the kids to like sit and watch and see if the insects preferred yellow or blue. But I'm hoping that, having more set amount of time watching particular flowers and seeing what visits them, it's definitely something that everyone can do and engage in. And, there's apps like iNaturalist where you can take photos and contribute to projects and things like that. So there's definitely those opportunities out there for sure.
And I guess that leads me to my next question for Dean, and looking at the projects and programs that you're offering and witnessing the mental health benefits with the people that you're working with.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kit's already mentioned meaning and purpose, but meaning and purpose are just so fundamental to human flourishing, and that goes to a very deep level. And I think when people find that they have agency and can actually contribute or do things, whether they're small or big, that actually starts to shape, or maybe they're finding their meaning and purpose in life. So we've seen pretty incredible, I'm not just talking about one or two examples here, I'm talking about dozens of incredible examples of people, particularly women, who've not had the opportunity to lead a community group or lead a project in their local area, outside work, who then become outstanding leaders and inspirers in their community. So we've got about 170 odd town teams around Australia now, and I'd say probably between 2/3 and 3/4 of those are led by women. So that's a significant change or difference to, the normal way things are done or previously have been done. But we find people of all ages, all genders, all backgrounds, once they start getting involved in this sort of stuff, it's not for everyone, of course, but some people really find what's important for them and really get a whole nother level of life. And I would go so far as to say it's life-changing. And I'm a personal example. I didn't quite know what I was supposed to be doing or where my life was heading and those kinds of things. But by doing what you think is important or having a go, you'll make plenty of mistakes, but it might actually be a really important stage of your life to find your purpose and find what you're really passionate about and what you would like to give your professional and personal time to. So that is like the biggest mental health boost you could ever hope to see in someone. And I think when those people start to feel and see this and discover this for themselves, that inspires more people to also go, well, gee, I remember her when she was not really confident enough to lead these sort of things, and look at her now. She's doing such incredible things, and I could do something similar, couldn't I, if I had a go, or I could be inspired by her examples. So we've seen lots of examples of that. And I think also the research in psychology is also catching on to this now. So psychology as a discipline has, in the past, been quite inward focused, whereas we're seeing now that some of that internal work is important, but also the external work in working with others and doing things in your local place also has really important psychological benefits as well. So I think, just by being connected with your community and trying or stepping outside your comfort zone, you do get some pretty significant mental health benefits. And, it's amazing when you think beyond yourself, whether you're caring for your family or for your friends or your workmate, when you think beyond yourself, that's actually a really good way to improve your mental health conditions, whether that's on a day-to-day level or at a much broader timescale.
And I guess, Dean, my next question leading on to this is, how can community leaders and councils create biodiverse spaces that promote both ecological and mental health?
Yeah, I start from a council level, and I worked in local government for 12 years and work with dozens of local governments now. And there's some fabulous people and brilliant programs that local governments do, but sometimes they feel like their job or their responsibility is to do it for communities, and sometimes that's needed. But what we often suggest or recommend is doing it with communities, or better still, enabling local people to do it by themselves. So doing for community might involve community consultation, or we're doing a new strategy or a policy, and what do you think about that? But then at the end of that process, it's the government's job to go and implement it for community. There's lots of ways you can do it with the community, and that might be where both the local government and the community take an active role in shaping what's going to happen then, but also making it happen on the ground. Or you can enable action by a community, and that might be through grants or other particular assistance to enable a community group or a friends of group to do it for themselves. So for councils and other government agencies, I'd encourage them to start to shift the balance a little bit more to doing it with community, or enabling communities or groups or local neighbours to do it by themselves, if possible. And for local people or local groups, start small. You might already be doing big things, and if you are, keep going on that. But often a big barrier is people feeling like they don't have the expertise or the confidence or the skills. And particularly note Dr. Kitt's point that sometimes you can do action and actually end up making things worse. So, of course, you want to do a little bit of research to make sure you're doing the right things, not making things worse. But we reckon that just starting small, so the Nature Block program, I think, is a great one, because you're going to start small and learn some things and realise that succulents maybe aren't native to your local area. That could be a learning. But then what is native to my local area, and how could I see what other people in my city have planted and learn from them? So just start on something but don't just do one thing. Start small, but then hopefully keep going and find other like-minded people in your street or in your community or in your friendship network who might want to support you, or even support them. If they're wanting to try new things, go to the meeting with them or support them, and then that might help you to work out what you're passionate about or what you might like to do as well. So just start on something is our bottom line.
I guess it's really about connection, collaboration, and networking. It's also about education and shared knowledges as well. So thank you for sharing that really important information. And Dr. Kit, my next question for you is, what simple actions can individuals take to support biodiversity?
Yeah, so the great thing about supporting like local native pollinators, it's something that everyone can do. So as we've touched on, as individuals, we can feel really hopeless, especially when we care so much about nature and the environment. And, we sort of hear that there's all these terrible things happening like climate change and biodiversity loss. We probably can't go and, help save the snow leopard, but we can do so much for our native pollinators and like physically see those benefits. So yeah, planting the right native plants. And that's where, education really comes in. So I've got a book called Creating a Haven for Native Bees, because I was saying there was this like big disconnect between sort of Google what plants to plant for bees and, actual like what I was seeing and what the published research was showing. And yeah, raising awareness about native bees and what you might expect to see, because if you don't know what to look for, yeah, you just miss out on those benefits of discovering biodiversity and being able to actually make meaningful actions. So I always say if people are going to, plant some native plants, the native fabaceae, so the native pea plants, and especially the native metaceae are really good. That's where street trees and working with like local council is really great, because there's a lot of initiatives to green our streets and plant street trees. But many of these street trees are inappropriate, like the jacarandas or other exotic trees. But if you have eucalypts lining your street, you will find so many native bees. The Angophora, the Melaleucas, Callistemon, eucalyptus, they're so good for our native bees. I published a paper a few years ago where I found that on a single native Corymbia, the Marri in Western Australia, 81 different species of native bees have been recorded from it. So that's like a huge diversity. And I will easily find 10 species of native bees on a verge tree of the metaceae. So yeah, making sure that we plant those local native plants. They don't have to be, some people also get really hung up and concerned that they can't get like the local provenance plant. When it comes to supporting native pollinators, it's all about the genus of the plant. So if you can't get that variety that is, indigenous to your very local area, you don't have to be like, it's so concerned. It's about getting those Australian natives in, and you'll see those benefits. So making sure that we plant native street trees, especially metaceae, in our gardens, have a selection of fabaceae, metaceae, scavola, fanflower is also a really great one. So there's a few like key native plants that are like my go-tos, and I've created like a little mural about them as well, because I feel like art is a great way of engaging people as well. So yeah, a little mural about some good native plants. Those simple actions, either working with local council or planting some of those native plants in your garden, is really effective. And that's where I also like working with nurseries, because they're obviously the ones that can provide people with the native plants. But lots of the sort of like big commercial nurseries, they just don't stock those things. So finding like a more native nursery, or even like talking to the more bigger scale nurseries and being like, hey, these are actually the plants that we want. As Dean was saying, like it's about working together with like different stakeholders and businesses, and then you're going to be able to achieve like so much change. Being big advocates as well for protecting local bushland, because we can do things in our gardens, but the source of biodiversity is going to be from our surrounding bushland. So we need to protect that so that, our gardens act as connectors and places where the native flora and fauna can go and live in and visit. But the source of that is our local bushland within urban areas. So we really have to protect that. So community can have a big voice as well in whether a council does go ahead with clearing bushland to make a football stadium or a parking lot or another Aldi or something. So yeah, making sure that we protect those original green spaces that can provide the source of the animals that will come and visit our local patches in our gardens.
To finish off, Kit, what's one key insight about biodiversity and well-being you hope listeners take away from this conversation today?
When you start becoming interested in biodiversity, it's like an open-ended adventure and quest. It's going to inspire you for like the rest of your life because there's always more things to discover, even in a local park. If you go there every single day and you look for insects, you're going to find different things. You're going to notice different things with the seasons. And so it's going to be something that can engage and inspire you for forever, which will give you, purpose and meaning and something to look forward to every day.
And Dean, what's one piece of advice you'd give to communities looking to create meaningful connections through biodiverse spaces?
A top tip is to just do it, but probably a little more helpfully, I think it's trying to find out what you're passionate about, either as an individual or as a group. Because once you understand your why or what you're passionate about, that really helps to motivate you. And if you're motivated, that helps to motivate other people. And often we just jump straight into the doing and forget about that personal why. But in that personal why or in the action, you might discover that what you really love doing is talking about this stuff or marketing this stuff or the social media side of this sort of stuff, rather than the planting or the maintaining things. But there might be other people who they don't want to talk to anyone, they just want to plant plants. So trying to drill down a little bit into what you're passionate about and what your why will help you, if times get tough or you hit an obstacle or two, that'll help to motivate you to keep going and to keep your personal motivation or your group motivation stronger. So finding your why and finding what you're passionate about can help to create more action.
And that's really about improving, our own personal human health, but it's about environmental health as well. So I'd really like to thank both you, Dr. Kit and Dean, for coming onto the podcast and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. I would like to pose a question to finish up to the audience who's listening today. How can you engage with or support a biodiverse space in your community to enhance both your well-being and local connectivity as well?
Thanks for listening to Nature, Health and Wellbeing. Visit conservationvolunteers.com.au for more information or download the CVA app.